Well, good morning, Mike. Land is an issue that I know is very much on your heart, and I wonder if you can just talk about why is land such a key issue in any society and for any government to consider as part of its overall public policy.
Well, land, rural land and urban property, we probably need to distinguish those two, are crucial in any society at a simple economic level. It's key to the distribution of wealth. Probably half the wealth of any society is in its property, including rural and urban land. But in a rural context, of course, it's also the key to both income generation and employment. So for all of those good economic reasons, it's important. But I think at a deeper level than that, it's also of vital importance for people's identity, and perhaps we can pursue that.
Right. So, coming to the Old Testament, what's the importance of land there?
Well, as we've discussed before, one needs to look at all of biblical teaching through a relational lens. One has to say, well, how is this piece of biblical teaching impacting on the way that people relate to each other? And property has an enormous impact on the way people relate, because if people have long-term roots in a community, they develop close relationships, not just with their extended family, but with all the other members of that local community, and there's therefore a degree of social accountability. People know what you've done in the past, and if you behave badly, then they will track that through to the future. Whereas if you are an individual and you keep moving around and you have no strong links into extended family and into a local community, what happens is that people then feel that they can behave as they like, and after they've made a mess of some marriage or messed up the lives of their children, whatever it is, they can just move on somewhere else. So the traditional patterns of land ownership in Africa, where people did have a long-term commitment not just to a location for their household, but also to their entire ethnic group. They were part of a larger geographic community, a region, if you like, of people who belonged to that ethnic group, had many relational advantages, although it had the downside also that unless the wider community had some kind of ethos of covenant or commitment to one another, it could also lead to tensions between those ethnic communities.
The Jubilee is a kind of a code for a set of laws around land, isn't it? Can you explain something of the implication of those land laws in the Old Testament?
When the Israelites came out of Egypt and entered the Promised Land, they came out as 12 ethnic groups who were all combined into one nation of Israel. And the issue was, is the land just going to be given out to individuals with individual rights to land, as we would tend to think today, or is the land going to be given out to whole ethnic groups? And the way that God told Israel to divide the land was not based on individual rights. The land was given out in tribal blocks. So each of the 12 tribes was given a block of land, and then within each of those tribal blocks, each clan was given a block of land, and within the clan, each extended family and nuclear family was given a chunk of land to farm as well. So you didn't have an individual right to the land. The land was yours, but to farm and to pass on to your children, but within the context of this wider social grouping. So this is again closer to African traditions towards land than it's closer to that than it is towards Western individual ownership of land, where the ownership of whether it's an urban house or a farm in a rural area is vested generally in a single individual.
And how about urban land? What was the difference? Because in the Bible that could be sold on a permanent basis.
Yes, probably I should have mentioned that in the rural areas then, the Jubilee provision meant that if a family ended up having to sell their land because they got very poor, they couldn't sell it on a freehold basis, they couldn't sell it forever. all they could do was lease it out until the next Jubilee year came round. So if the year 2000 was a Jubilee year, then 2050 would be a Jubilee year, and 2100 would be a Jubilee year every 50 years. So if it was, let's say it was 2025, you could lease out your land for a maximum of 25 years, and then in 2050 the family would get it back free of charge with no debts and nothing else, and they would then be able to start again. So in every generation you had a chance at least once in your life, as it were, to start again. In the urban land context, and these urban areas were defined quite closely, you could buy and sell property, but the seller had the right to buy it back for 12 months after they'd sold it. So in a sense, the system was loaded in favour of the person selling, and that was to prevent distress sales of land, and it was also to slow down the land market and stop people speculating.
Oh, which has a lot of resonance today. One of the objections that people raise to the Old Testament system of keeping land within the tribes is that as population increased, the plots would be subdivided so much that they would no longer be economically viable. How did the Old Testament model anticipate that? Or
yes, we're seeing that happening in many African countries today. Take Kenya, which I know very well. In a lot of rural areas of Kenya, you're seeing the land subdivided and subdivided and subdivided. Partly that was restrained by a male inheritance system, because if the land is inherited equally by both men and women, as it were, male and female children, you subdivide the land twice as rapidly as if you have either it going through the male line or the female line. So you slow it down by having it through one gender and not both genders, but also you slow it down by not making it easy to export your surplus children to the cities. If you export your surplus children to the cities, as people do in Kenya, from Western Kenya they send them down to Kisumu or Nairobi or even Mombasa to find jobs, then people have 9 or 10 children expecting that 5 of them will move off to the city. But if you can't do that, if in the end you restrict, as it were, the size of the cities, then people have to start saying, well, am I better to have just 2 or 3 children and divide the land between them, or am I better to have 9 or 10 children and divide it into very tiny plots? So there then becomes a sort of self-regulating factor in population growth, which is also very important. But then you have to ask the question, well, how would all of this apply today? I mean, how could we possibly apply it today? And Jesus says in Matthew 4:4, that human beings shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So I think we start from an assumption that this teaching has relevance now, today, and we have to say, well, what is it? And I suppose the first thing we would want to say is that there is a principle that every family should be able to own property. And whether that's an urban piece of land or ideally a rural piece of land, that idea that every family has a stake of land in a country seems to me an important Christian principle, and would be hugely challenging to apply in South Africa. We might come back to that. Secondly, I think it underlines the importance of the co-location of relatives, that is, relatives living reasonably close to each other. Again, in Old Testament Israel, the extended family didn't live in one house. They lived in different houses, but in the same village, or on the same piece of land. So the idea that relatives live reasonably close to each other, which is much easier in a rural than an urban environment, allows them much more easily to provide the social care that is needed if someone is disabled, if somebody is old or is sick. The whole extended family is there to provide support, rather than looking to the government or looking to weaker relationships with neighbours. So I think this idea of relatives living close enough to support each other is another very important principle that Christians should be seeking to apply where they can.
Great, thank you.